Hi, it's Todd, and I'm talking about Tomb of the Serpent Kings. Tomb of the Serpent Kings is a beginner adventure dungeon that was created by this guy, Skirples. Or I think he's a guy, maybe not. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Who runs the Coins and Scrolls blog. Uh, I come across this adventure a lot because it's one that's often cited as a great beginner dungeon. And it is. I haven't run it myself, but I've read it many times, and I've even recommended it, having not run it, simply because the way it's laid out, and this was done purposefully by Skirples, to present lessons for new players and GMs. Having read it, it's probably not my favorite module that I would probably run with a beginner group, but I'm not a beginner dungeon master at this point, so I would probably pick something maybe a little bit more complex, a little bit more open-ended. But if you want to learn about designing dungeons and the sort of things that you might want to expect in a dungeon as someone who might create them or as a player running them, Tomb of the Serpent Kings is a good choice. It's almost funny in some regards because the lessons that it gives you are very good, but they're probably not going to be followed maybe as much as you would hope for in other modules. So, for example, things like the consistency of fictional elements that it presents, because it wants to teach you about, if you expect something in a dungeon, how you can kind of set up that expectation and pay off that expectation. And it's funny because it's great advice, and you would like your players to be able to fictionally depend on stuff on the consistency of the world or of just a particular location, a dungeon. But often that's not the case. And sometimes it's not the case for a good reason. Other times it's simply because either if it's a homebrew dungeon, you could be forgetful as the creator or just sloppy, which happens, or even in a professionally created dungeon, the same thing. Things are not always consistent, and it's not always done purposefully. Sometimes it's even done purposefully to be inconsistent, and there's some kind of reason behind that. But the module goes through and it at least does a nice job setting sort of maybe what your base expectation should be for when you're coming across a dungeon. And it does help you think about critically looking at a dungeon as a player or as a GM, how it exists in the fiction. So here's the map. You can see that it's not overly complicated. It's mostly linear, right? So you're going to come in up here and you can move. It's got some side chambers. You're going to come in kind of through here. And really, until you get to this central room, you don't really have much choices. There's a secret passage there. They can get you into a chamber, but there's no way out. The way is linear. Once you get here, depending on how you move around as a party, there's a secret passage here that can take you on the express down to this kind of second area of the dungeon, second part of the complex. Or if you keep following the linear path, you're naturally going to come out to this chasm, which can then lead you again to these second parts of the different entrances into the second part of the dungeon. So there's not a lot of choices as a player, which is probably a good thing if it's your first dungeon. There's obviously a plenty to explore just even in this first part, but it's not going to overwhelm you with the sort of analysis paralysis of multiple long passages that you can't see the end of. I mean, clearly there are doors and there are little passages, but in this first area, you're going to be able to check those 4 rooms out relatively quickly. I'll just slide that down. See it? And the same thing for in this area. You're going to be able to see all the doors. If you go and you check the doors, you're going to quickly find that only one of them is really a true passage and the other one's ended chambers. So the layout is going to be fairly straightforward, but there is that nice surprise in that room there. If you happen to be able to find the secret door, that does give you another option, right, of what to do. Now let's go ahead and look at some of these rooms. So here, as far as the module layout, it's very well done. He wants to tell you, he tells you about the kind of lessons and the structure and sort of the two, these 3 rather levels, and what's happening each one and kind of how they fit as a theme. And that's very nice for a dungeon master to be able to read that and get a good idea of kind of what you're looking at, right? It's always nice, even though, yeah, we're supposed to read everything back to front before you do it, to give you kind of, as a reader, sort of expectations of how things work. And then we're going to get into the actual meat of the dungeon. I'm not going to go through every page, but I'm just going to go through a few things just to highlight sort of how the dungeon is laid out and a few things about it. I really like these little maps. One of the things that can be annoying when you're flipping through an adventure is you're flipping from the key, which is here, to see what room you're in, then referring back to the map to see where that room fits in there, and to be able to look at it and say, okay, I know we came in here, and here's the general area where I am, and when I get to here, I'll know I'll have to, have this section, and then I'll know to flip the page and go on other things. Otherwise, I can kind of stay on this page and know that everything is kind of at my fingertips. It's a very nice touch. I kind of wish more dungeons would kind of take that approach of giving me a little localized map there. I mean, I know it can take up space and everything, but it's a nice to have. You'll also see that he's got these call out boxes around, and within there he'll talk about, lessons. This first one, the dungeon is organized, right? There are patterns, and there's also hidden treasure. Now, it's interesting, these things about organization and patterns, because, as I mentioned sort of at the top, not everything is going to be organized, and there aren't always going to be patterns, and patterns aren't always going to hold. And as a player, your character, sometimes you have to be aware of that, particularly if you're looking at a dungeon that may be more or less randomly put together, right? If you're doing a dungeon that was sort of randomly generated, there may not be a pattern. Or if it's hasn't been randomly generated, but it's something that by its very nature is not organized in a particular way, or has seen multiple uses. So, for example, here's a tomb, and this area of the tomb is basically left alone. But what if this had started off as a tomb and then had been taken over, say, by bugbears, and then the bugbears had left and lizard men had moved in? And so I've gone and, if I had gone through and said, okay, well, it used to be this, and now it's something else, and now it was this to these people, to the bugbears, but now it's something this to the lizard men, that's going to change the patterns. Even if there's a pattern to each one of those eras of use, the current, what you're looking at now as a ruin, is going to be some kind of jumble of those uses, and the pattern may not be as easily discernible or discernible at all. Another thing, another option might be that the nature of it is not sane. There's all kinds of, particularly in old school classic Dungeons and Dragons, you have towers for mad wizards and other things of sort of insane, demons and devils and things, and they may break patterns intentionally. You also have things like mimics that are creatures that, are kind of a meme at this point with everything being a mimic, but they're sort of pattern breakers, right? You see something, you think you know what it is. You see something else, you think you know what it is. You think the third thing, bang, it's a mimic. It breaks. It's an intentional praise on your expectation of consistency. But all that being said, it's not a bad thing to at least begin to approach a place as if it has a pattern, because recognizing those patterns will probably be helpful to you, whether or not ultimately the dungeon sticks to them. Being able to see the sort of pattern is a good thing as a player. And if you're creating dungeons, by the same token, these are, again, things you can play with. If you know that there are patterns, and that's something that you can use to your advantage, whether to play against that pattern or to reward players who pick up on your pattern. So ultimately it's a good lesson. Though I feel like with all these things, we have to take it with a grain of salt. Maybe in the ideal world, everything would follow these types of rules. We have to be ready that they're going to break them. But when we're starting out, it's nice to just see some kind of idea of how maybe things should work in sort of an ideal running of the game, in an ideal sort of universe. And again, there are more lessons in the fourth room. The idea is that hidden treasure can be magical, can be cursed, sometimes it can be useful. I'm not sure really what that lesson is, other than, it's not maybe the most impactful lesson that I feel like anyone going into a game is going to know that there's hidden treasure and that it can be magical, but, fair enough. It's certainly not a bad thing that, yes, you're going to run into magical equipment And the fact that it might be cursed is something to keep in mind, because yeah, not everything is going to be helpful. Not everything's going to be a +1 to you. It might be something that either has a negative aspect attached to it, or it's just a curse, something that you're going to need to get rid of. And one of the big things in that 5th room, so we're just in the first page of the actual dungeon. Hey, there are deadly traps. And this one, I think, particularly for classic D&D play, is important. Any space is a lethal space. Any dungeon can be lethal. It doesn't even have to be the classic save or die scenario, because anything doing 1d6 of damage, if you get the wrong roll, is a killer. If it does more damage than that, then it's almost certainly going to kill you. And on top of it, if you are playing a classic game, and this Tomb of the Serpent King, it's pretty much system agnostic, but it's generally coming at things from sort of an OSR, sort of classic gaming perspective. So it definitely doesn't shy away from having a lethal trap. Within the first, this trap could be, depending on how the party moves, could be the first thing they experience. They walk in, maybe they're a little bit skittish of these rooms, or they don't, they want to find out what's, further down first, and bam, they could hit that straight away. That could be, that trap could be the first one that they spot. Now, that being said, it's a well done trap in the sense that it's something that players can figure out. It's not a super kind of gotcha trap. And I feel like there's a lot of hatred towards sort of gotcha traps, as if the GM is trying to trick you. But there is a place for them. And there is, I think, the concept of being sort of fictionally positioned. I think I think it's Tower of the Stargazer. I haven't read it precisely. I've kind of flipped through it a couple times, where it's got some traps that can be described as sort of gotchas. And I believe it's another sort of beginner style dungeon. But the idea behind it is that you're in the castle of a wizard. And so your expectations, your character expectations, your expectations in the fiction should be that there is going to be things that's just dangerous, because you're messing around in a wizard's laboratory or in a wizard's home, and that wizard is going to be tricksy, and it's not going to be playing fair, and he's not going to be playing, trying to take it easy on you. You're intruders in his home, and the wizard is a very dangerous being with lots of supernatural powers at their disposal, and they are going to put in things to trick you because they can, and that you should expect that as a player and as a character, and you should act accordingly. So, if you go into the wizard's lab and there's a vial, you don't just drink it, because who knows what kind of potion is in there. Don't assume that it should be good, or that it shouldn't be bad. It shouldn't be lethal because it's laying there, and don't assume that this room is mundane and ordinary just because that's how it looks. You're in a wizard's house. You need to expect the unexpected. You need to expect lots of arcane, shenanigans. And the same thing to a degree in a tomb. If you're going into a tomb and this tomb looks like it's been undisturbed, you should think to yourself, why does it look undisturbed, right? Why hasn't this door been opened? And, in the case of this door kind of hammer trap, it doesn't say whether there's any bones or anything to indicate that something happened. Sometimes, those clues will be evident in the description in the dungeon. We can also add them ourselves if we felt like we wanted to show some kind of clue that things died here and didn't make it through the door, and that should give clue that it's a trap. We could say that there are remains. Maybe there's a dented helmet, or just a busted up shield, or a skull that's been just kind of shattered that's laying there. And that becomes an indication, or it should, of something is wrong here. But of course, in any kind of ruin, right at the surface, and you see there's a big door and it's shut and it doesn't look like it's been broken in or resealed or anything, that should also be kind of its own warning, because the first thing you should be asking as a character is, boy, the entrance to this tomb isn't open and that door seems to just be shut. Why is that? Does something live here and that's why it's shut? Or is there a trap? why hasn't this door been opened? So we move down, and it's going, we're going through room by room. And again, each room's going to have a lesson. Each room, each page is going to have the sort of local layout. And like I said, the lessons are pretty good. It's going to kind of walk you through secret passages, or at least the fact that there can be secret passages doesn't mean that the players are going to find them, but they're there. And kind of introduces to you the steps as a dungeon master as to what to do with secret doors. When you're reading through this, here there's a pattern that they give you. Secret passages are associated with statues. So what does that tell you? How do you start to begin to think about that as a character if you run across this once? How do you as a dungeon master begin to describe them if you want to make sure that that kind of association is there to be understood? Because remember, the DM really is sort of the camera lens through which the players are all looking at it. If you don't describe things in a way that makes a relationship clear, it's going to be hard for the players to pick up on it. So you might want to, when they discover their first secret door, or when you want to start laying out these sort of ideas, these hints, you're going to want to layer that in your descriptions. So they make sure that they can get a sense of maybe there is a relationship between statues and these kind of secrets. Now, statues are kind of funny in this sort of fantasy role plays, in my experience, because, whenever I'm as a dungeon master and there's a room with a statue in a dungeon, or I'm a player, it's always something I'm super wary of, particularly if it has a humanoid kind of form. If it's a statue of something, it doesn't even have to be humanoid, any kind of creature, right? Because the thing is you're looking at is you're thinking any second this thing is going to come alive. And the other thing you think of is that, is there something secret inside it, underneath it, behind it, whatever it is it might be covering? Those are kind of the two thought processes that run through your head. A, it's going to come alive and try to kill us. And or B, it's hiding something. It's just kind of funny, because having played so many games, it's one of those gotcha sort of moments that it's hard for GMs to resist. It's just so easy to have the statue, and then as soon as their backs are turned, it comes alive. But, as a player, you see it so many times, and, you start to expect it. And from the secret standpoint, it's also one of those things that, it also just makes too much sense to have something hidden underneath the pedestal of a statue, or you have to put the gem in the statue's hand, and that happens. Statues are often signifiers of something for good or ill, or both. So it's kind of natural, even in this starter dungeon, to kind of set up that relationship. If you're a new player and you've never played any of these games, well, get used to the significance of statues. But moving on, again, you can see that there are lots and lots of lessons. There's an ooze for you here in room 14. There's there's a lesson of listening. Pits and pools being sort of places that can be dangerous, but also are places where treasure can be hid. And these are all kind of classic, right? It's kind of running you through these sort of classic tropes of the dungeon. The pool that may have something in it, but also has something good at the bottom of it. If you could figure out how to dodge whatever monster or kill whatever thing is in the pool, and then there's something that you can go get at the bottom of it. Or, oozes, and trying to figure out what kind of ooze it is and what is it weak to, and how do you, destroy it, or gelatinous cubes. And in this case, it's what kind of ooze? They have it as a black pudding, gray ooze, yellow mold, all these kind of classic sort of dungeon denizens that, here in your starter dungeon, you're getting a sort of a sampling of these different things, but it's not done in sort of a funhouse way where it's just, we're going to throw a cube in here, we're going to throw an ooze in here, we're going to throw skeletons over here. It's done in a way that sort of makes sense, and gives you sort of a good fictional basis for it. You can reason through these things as a player, and yet you still get a taste for these different sort of creatures. that are here. Once you get to kind of the second level, and I guess this is the third level. Let me see. Did we get through the second one? Once you get down, well, anyway, when you get down to the third level, it's throwing in, again, a classic sort of low-level villain, which is, goblins. And it's just one of those other layers. I'm not sure if it tells you about that lesson specifically, but, there are things there's always things, or almost always things living in these tombs that have taken it over for secondary use. And I even talked before at the very start about, patterns and breaking patterns through the fact of having multiple residents of these different ruins. And so, it makes sense that here in this, it's not just an empty kind of dead tomb with just some ooze or, some things in it, but that there's actual, living things in it. And so they, introduce goblins. So I'm not going to go through the rest of this. It's a really good read. It's a quick read. It's free. I don't know if there are really any other sort of teaching dungeons. Maybe I guess that's probably what I would call this ultimately. And here's sort of the monster list, is that it's a good teaching dungeon for either you as a game master, even if you don't end up running it as a thing. It doesn't fit in what you're trying to do. Maybe thematically it's not what you're looking for. But even just as a reading exercise, it's a good look at sort of things that represent solid dungeon design. It's not, tombs of, it's not the taverns of Thracia or something that's just amazing and crazy and has all kinds of really, the Caverns of Thracia is a super old, dungeon, but it constantly gets referenced today because it just had such an amazing, interesting design. And this is not that, and it's not trying to be that. And, there's a reason why Caverns of Thracia is still held up as something today, years and years and years after it was created, because it's something that's incredibly hard to do. But as far as giving you a good basis, giving you something to look at and learn, and then riff off to do your own thing, and has the explanations go along with it, which I think is sort of the big thing, that the takeaway that I like about it, again, is sort of a teaching thing. Not only does it give you sort of exemplars of different things that you can use, just individual rooms and the way they're set up and what's in them, and it doesn't try to throw you a ton of things at once. It lets each first idea of something sort of rest on its own, but it gives you sort of that lesson. And again, some of the lessons are going to appear no-brainer to you, or and fairly uninteresting, and some lessons might be something that you hadn't thought about, But either way, you can take those and then you can use them in your own creations, or use them as the basis for your own creations, or something to think about when you're building your own dungeon. Because it's helpful to think about these basics, even if you're someone who's made a lot of dungeons before, because it's very easy when you're creating something like this to make it overly complicated, to make it overly subtle, to think that your players are going to find everything that you're putting in front of them. And you can sometimes forget that things that might make sense internally in your brain, the way you thought about a place when you drew it out or when you wrote it up, is maybe not how it appears to someone who's looking at it, either through what you end up saying, sort of, in the concept of what you think in your head, you're saying, and sort of what you're actually saying can be, two different things. So being able to look at these kind of lessons and kind of look at them again and think of what you're creating in terms of patterns, in terms of how you're using particular monsters, in terms of sort of risk and reward, right? You put some kind of monster in a pool, that's a risk, and there should be some kind of reward on the end of it. Not that everything necessarily has to have a huge pile of treasure at it, but if there's something out there, there should be some kind of risk or reward to it. In modern D&D, it might be less important because you get so much of your experience, or all of your experience, or depending on how you run a game, most of it comes from combat itself. So maybe you say, well, that monster, given that it's going to earn them X amount of XP, is its own reward. But definitely when you're going back to playing classic games, the killing monsters earns a pittance compared to finding treasure. So if you're putting an interesting monster or an interesting trap, it's a good, reading things like this module are good reminders of things that need to go along with it, thinking that can be and should be applied to those situations. If I'm putting a monster in this area, why is it there? Not necessarily from a fictional standpoint, why is there fragments of a mummy in a pool? You can come up with a reason, but there isn't necessarily off the top of your head something obvious. But as far as a mechanically, structurally for this dungeon, why is it there? Because the pool is something that has valuable treasure in it. And so that treasure should be guarded by something. It doesn't have to be a monster. It could be a trap. It could just be that hard. If you make that pool, say, 40 feet deep or 50 feet deep, that's a challenge to get that treasure out of there. And that maybe that's all you need. It doesn't have to be a monster. It doesn't have to be a literal trap, but it can be a challenge. It could be something like, okay, there's diamonds in the ceiling, but the ceiling's 80 feet up. How do you get the diamonds off the ceiling? And then maybe there's some other monster down further down in the dungeon that is somehow attracted to these diamonds. And so you create these other problems, but they're relationships that come out of the structures of the dungeon and their way that you link things together and their ways you make everything fit. And I think that this dungeon does a good job of at least starting to giving you fodder to make you think about those things. Anyway, I think that's all I have to say on it. You can find the dungeon at Coins and Scrolls. I believe it's Coins and Scrolls at blogspot.blogspot.com. I think this is his new book. I just happened to go to the homepage, so there it is. But it's a great resource, and I definitely think it's worth reading. And if you're a new GM and you need something to run, I would say give it a read and think about running it. And if you don't run it, I think it's got some good lessons for you to absorb. I hope you liked this video, and please, if you did, please think about subscribing. Otherwise, I will talk to you later.